Regret in the avoidant is not a passing weather system. It does not arrive, create some turbulence, and then dissipate into the ordinary atmosphere of a life moving forward. When it takes root, when it attaches itself to a specific person, a specific loss, a specific reckoning with what was present and what was chosen over it, it becomes something permanent. A feature of the interior landscape rather than a temporary condition. Something carried without witnesses in the private geography of a person who has built their entire identity around not needing and is now living inside the undeniable evidence that the not needing was never as complete as the performance suggested. Not every loss generates this kind of regret in the avoidant. Not every departure, every ending, every person who moved through their life and then out of it leaves the specific mark that produces the long, deep, privately devastating reckoning described above. The avoidant loses people regularly, through their own withdrawal, through the erosion of patience in the people they keep at arm's length, through the gradual attrition of connection that insufficient reciprocity inevitably produces. Most of these losses, while perhaps noted and briefly mourned in whatever muted form avoidant mourning takes, do not produce the deep regret. They are absorbed into the general narrative of someone who simply does better alone. The losses that produce the deep regret are specific. They are the losses of people who were doing something, for particular things, that the avoidance interior registered as extraordinary, even when the avoidance exterior was treating as ordinary. These 4 things are not dramatic. They are not grand gestures or exceptional sacrifices or the performance of an extraordinary love. They are qualities, specific, consistent, internal qualities that express themselves through behavior, that made the person who possessed them unlike anyone else in the avoidance relational history. And it is precisely because they were unlike anyone else that their absence after the leaving generates the regret that does not resolve. The first, they maintained their sense of self throughout. The most common casualty of loving an avoidant is the self of the person doing the loving. Not through any deliberate act of the avoidant, not through cruelty or manipulation or the conscious dismantling of another person's identity, but through the natural, inexorable pressure that the avoidance dynamic creates, the constant low-level message that less of you is safer, that smaller needs are more tolerable, that the version of yourself that does not require too much is the version most likely to keep the warmth available. Most people who love avoidance eventually adapt to this pressure. The adaptation happens slowly, invisibly, in the incremental adjustments of someone who is trying to preserve a connection that keeps threatening to withdraw. They soften their needs. They moderate their expression. They become, over time, a slightly diminished version of themselves, not dramatically, not in ways that are visible in a single moment, but in the cumulative way of someone who has been, over months or years, living slightly inside the limits of what the avoidance system could tolerate, rather than in the full extent of who they actually are. The person who does not do this, who maintains throughout the relationship and throughout all of its difficulties, the full and uncompromised presence of who they actually are, is doing something so rare in the avoidance relational experience that it registers as genuinely extraordinary. Not always consciously. Often the avoidant does not have the language to identify what they are experiencing in the presence of this person's sustained selfhood, but it registers in the specific quality of being with someone whose personhood does not bend to accommodate the avoidance limitations, in the felt sense of encountering a self that is fully occupied by its own values, its own perspectives, its own emotional truth, in a way that the avoidance distancing cannot erode. The regret that follows the loss of this person has a specific texture, because the avoidant, in the aftermath of the loss, encounters the world of people who are not this person. And the world of people who are not this person tends, in comparison, to offer the compliant, accommodating, self-diminishing dynamic that the avoidance system finds more immediately manageable. And manageable, the avoidant discovers too late, is not the same as meaningful. The ease of connection with someone who adapts themselves to the avoidance limitations is not the ease of genuine intimacy. It is the ease of being unchallenged. And unchallenged, without the specific counterweight of the person who remained fully themselves, begins to feel like a different kind of emptiness. The emptiness of a life that is protected but not really lived. The second, They were honest without being cruel. The avoidance relational history tends to produce one of two responses to their patterns in the people around them. Either the people accommodate, absorbing the withdrawal and the inconsistency and the emotional unavailability into a narrative that minimizes or excuses it in service of preserving the connection. Or the people react, allowing the accumulated frustration of loving someone who consistently withholds to build until it releases in the form of anger, ultimatum, or the emotionally charged confrontation that the avoidant then uses as justification for the retreat they were already preparing to make. The person who does neither, who tells the truth about the avoidance behavior with a directness that is neither accommodating nor aggressive, who names what is happening without the distortion of suppressed resentment on one side or the distortion of fearful minimization on the other, is doing something the avoidant has almost never experienced: being told the truth cleanly. Being given the specific, honest, carefully delivered account of what their behavior actually produces in the person receiving it, not as an attack to be defended against, not as a performance of distress designed to produce guilt, but as genuine information offered by someone who respects both the avoidant and themselves enough to be honest rather than convenient. This honesty is, for the avoidant, one of the most uncomfortable and most ultimately valuable gifts they can receive. It is uncomfortable because truth about the impact of the avoidance behavior requires the avoidant to hold two things simultaneously that their system resists holding together: the genuine care of the person delivering the truth and the accountability that the truth demands. It is valuable because, in the rare cases where the avoidance defenses do not immediately neutralize it, it constitutes one of the few experiences capable of producing genuine self-reflection about the pattern. The regret that follows the loss of someone who offered this clean honesty is the regret of someone who recognizes, in retrospect, that the discomfort the honesty created was not a flaw in the connection. It was the most important feature of it. The discomfort was the truth doing its work, arriving in the place where unexamined patterns live and creating the friction that genuine change requires. The loss of someone who could do this, who could hold you accountable without making the accountability feel like an assault, is the loss of something that cannot be easily replicated in a world where most people either tell you what you want to hear or tell you what their unmanaged frustration needs to express. The third, they kept showing up without losing their dignity. There is a particular quality of sustained presence that certain people bring to their relationships with avoidance that is unlike either of the more common alternatives. Not the anxious, pursuing, increasingly desperate staying of someone whose self-worth has become entangled with the avoidance response to them, and not the self-protective, walls-up, already half-gone staying of someone who has decided to protect themselves from further hurt by no longer fully investing. But something more nuanced, more difficult, and more ultimately significant than either. The staying that keeps its dignity. The presence that is consistent without being consuming. The person who shows up again and again through the withdrawals and the silences and the moments where the avoidance system did its most effective work of pushing them toward the door, without making the showing up a sacrifice that they present for acknowledgement, without making the consistency a pressure that demands reciprocal investment in return, without making the staying a loss of self. They were there, reliably, quietly, without the performance of their own reliability, simply present, in the specific way of someone who has made a choice and is living it rather than announcing it. This quality of dignified consistency is one of the rarest things the avoidant ever encounters, because the ordinary outcome of sustained presence with an avoidant is the gradual erosion of the dignity of the person sustaining it, through the accumulated weight of unreciprocated investment, through the specific diminishment of being consistently treated as less of a priority than the avoidant's own comfort, through the exhaustion of maintaining the staying against the continuous resistance of the avoidance withdrawal. Most people who stay do so at an increasing cost to their own sense of self. The cost becomes visible, and the avoidant, whose system is finely calibrated to the emotional weather of the people around them, registers the cost and files it, consciously or not, as the confirmation that connection is, as they have always feared, ultimately damaging. The person who stays without the cost becoming visible, who maintains their dignity not through the suppression of the hurt, but through the genuine, sustained self-possession of someone who is choosing to be present from a place of strength rather than need, provides the avoidant with something their history has almost never offered. The experience of being stayed for without being made responsible for the staying. The experience of someone's consistent presence as a gift, freely given, rather than an investment demanding return. The regret at their loss is specific and lasting, because what they provided cannot be manufactured in another person. It was the product of their particular interior, their particular combination of genuine caring and genuine self-respect. And the avoidant, encountering the world without it, discovers that the world does not readily produce it again. The fourth, they left before the avoidant was ready. This is the most difficult of the four to examine honestly, because it sits at the intersection of the avoidant's psychology and something that looks from the outside simply like timing. But the leaving before the avoidant was ready is not just a circumstance. It is, in many cases, the product of the first three qualities, the natural consequence of someone who maintained themselves, who was honest, who kept their dignity, eventually reaching the conclusion that the connection was not adequately meeting what they needed. And it is, paradoxically, the quality that most reliably produces the deepest and most lasting regret. The avoidance system is calibrated, as discussed throughout these pieces, around the availability of the other person's investment as a background certainty, the continuous ambient awareness that someone is oriented toward them, that the connection exists as a given, that the warmth is available whenever the avoidance system permits approach, is one of the quiet foundations of the avoidance stability. They do not acknowledge this dependency. They may not even consciously register it, but it operates, and its removal produces the specific, destabilizing, regret-generating experience of losing a foundation they did not know they were building on. When the person leaves, genuinely finally, from the clean place of someone who has exhausted their waiting and reclaimed their own life, rather than from the reactive place of someone whose pain has generated an ultimatum they may retract, the avoidant faces something their system has no adequate preparation for. The loss is not hypothetical. It is not the theoretical consequence of the avoidance behavior that they have been vaguely aware of and managed to continue setting aside. It is actual. It is present. It is permanent in the way that only the departures of people who leave with their dignity intact tend to be permanent. And the readiness that the avoidant did not have when the leaving happened, the readiness for the vulnerability, the commitment, the full and present choosing that the connection always required, begins to develop in the very absence it was unable to develop in the presence. The loss teaches what the presence could not. And the teaching arrives too late, in the specific and irreversible way that the avoidant's most important lessons tend to arrive, after the person who most needed them to be learned has already, quietly, and with complete dignity, gone. These four things are not a manual for staying. They are not a prescription for how to behave in order to produce the avoidant's eventual regret, as though the goal of the relationship was always the avoidant's future reckoning rather than genuine mutual connection. They are simply an honest description of the qualities that the avoidance interior recognizes as extraordinary. That register beneath all the defenses and all the suppression and all the practiced management of genuine feeling as the marks of someone genuinely rare. If you have been doing these four things, maintaining yourself, being honest, showing up with dignity, and eventually, when the showing up was no longer serving you, leaving with that same dignity intact, you are not failing to love the avoidant correctly. You are loving them in the only way that love retains its integrity. And they know it, in the quiet, private, unwitnessed way that the avoidant knows all the things that matter most. They know exactly what they had, and exactly what, through the operation of a fear they are still learning to face, they let go.